election is in the air. And of course, we're waiting for all the negotiations and perhaps announcements coming in from the various political parties to come across very, very fast as well. On top of this, tomorrow, the Prime Minister also double hatting as the Finance Minister Wan, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, will also be presenting the Budget 2026. Here to discuss this and more is Yang Berhormat Amira Aisya Abdul Aziz, the acting president of MUDA. So, Amira, let's talk a little bit more about the current ongoings of the political dynamics. Of course, Sabah, domestic politics is a little bit different from the rest of, say, for instance, Semenanjung or Peninsula. But this is, of course, a timely notion considering that the budget is also in the air. What kind of ideas that you have when it comes to the budget? Will it be more of a politicized or a political campaign kind of budget, or is this more of a BAU kind of thing?
Yep. I think first and foremost, thank you so much, Ibrahim, for having me on your show. First and foremost, when we're talking about the Sabah states election itself, I found that when it comes to Sabah and also Sarawak, both states election are very unique in its own way. It's very different from what we have in the Peninsula Malaysia. I've been in Sabah during the last states election. I was there for close to 1 month, and I've seen the dynamics of political parties in Sabah. I've seen how the politics was played out in Sabah. Although I'm not Sabahan, I feel that there's a strong connection. I feel a very strong connection to the plight of the people in Sabah. As you know, and we're talking about budget, going into budget as well, 8 of the 10 poorest district in Malaysia is in Sabah. I've been to some of these districts during election. I've seen, for example, an island called Pulau Bangi, which is one of the biggest island in Malaysia, and how the people on that island is living in, very stricken poverty. The houses do not have access of water, do not have access of clean water. Some of them do not have access of electricity. And these are the things that politicians have to think of, whether they are from Sabah or even those who are not from Sabah, especially the Prime Minister heading towards the budget 2026, is how do we, entering into the budget, how do we then close these gaps between states or regions like Kuala Lumpur, regions like Johor, that have definitely higher income in comparison to other states. And coming into Sabah states election, it would also be very important for political parties and politicians campaigning in Sabah, and also to start championing about this and talking about how can they improve the livelihoods of Sabahans in general, and not just playing into political enmity, political fights that have always been.
I'll pick up economic planning and vis-a-vis, say, for instance, MUDA's position in Sabah. Will you be fielding people there? And by the way, this is the kind of interviews that I dread, to convolute two different ideas,
Yeah.
but it is what it is, So let's start with that. Where is MUDA's positioning when it comes to economic planning and economic prosperity? What positions would you like to take when it comes to this year's budget?
First and foremost, I think it's very important to admit the fact that we do have some increment in terms of national income, which is something that we should celebrate. However, I feel that definitely it's still not enough. Our fiscal deficit stays around 3.8% of the country's income, and what we are targeting, so that by the end of RMK 13, or by the end of Malaysia's Plan 13, that will be able to reduce that fiscal deficit to less than 3%. I think this is very, very important, because we want to talk about, for example, progressive wage. We want to talk about more dignified living. We want to talk about stronger social security. We want to talk about better healthcare, better education. So it is so important at a high level for us to see in the 2026 budget what is the government's plan to have a better balance between the country's debts and also the country's income. All countries have debts. That's something that we cannot deny. It's just how do we manage all these things. When we're talking about MUDA's economic expectation in the 2026 budget, I like to focus on 5 main things, and we can go deeper on all those things. The first one is in terms when we're talking about income, right? You cannot run away from talking about taxation and also subsidy. And it is so important to talk about that right now, especially because government just rolled out the RON
Budi
95,
95, yeah.
the Budi 95 targeted subsidy. I would like to preface by saying that I am a supporter of targeted subsidy. I believe that we do need targeted subsidy so that the wealth can be better circulated, so that those who really deserve it will get a bigger subsidy than those who might not necessarily need those subsidies, right? But what I'm thinking of when we're talking about Budi 95, for example, one of the biggest question that I have was initially when government was rolling out this subsidy, they mentioned that this is targeting the Mahakaya or the ultra rich. But once it's rolled out, you can see that it's no longer targeting Mahakaya. It is separating between Malaysians and non-Malaysians, which I'm also not opposing of. I think it's very important for us to prioritize Malaysians to have that subsidy. But what is the plan so that our taxation can become a more progressive taxation system, so that we tax higher to the rich, then the less privileged will get more of that. So when we're talking about taxation, before we go to other matters, MUDA has always been a huge proponent of tax reform. Among the things that we're really been championing of, for example, during COVID, we've been Syed Saddiq, as our only MP in Parliament, has been the proponent and the first person
For the time being.
for the time being. He's the only person there. But during the COVID era, he was the one who was fighting about the windfall tax, and that's something we really believe in. Windfall tax, or in Malay, it's called cukai durian runtuh, when a corporation or company experience unprecedented wealth during certain times, right? Kekayaan luar biasa. And we think it's very important for us to still put this windfall tax into the system, because these corporations, these companies are getting this huge wealth because of some sufferings have happened to other people. This have happened multiple times. For example, the petrol company has experienced this. Our palm oil company has experienced this. This is something that is not secluded to only during COVID. We're not suggesting for that tax to be huge. It could be, between 0.5 to 1%. Most importantly is that how do you balance between that tax to exist and also for the people to benefit from it? That's one thing. Number two, we've been a huge proponent of capital gains tax. And if the government is serious into, because this is something that PMX consistently say, to target the ultra rich, the government should also, be serious into really looking into capital gains tax in 2026 budget, so that those who, acquire bond, acquire stocks, and all these people will be taxed on those capitals. You can make it into a progressive way where, if you have a lesser amount of bonds, a lesser amount of stock, then maybe your tax would not be that high, right? And the third one we're talking about tax also is about inheritance tax. And it's not something that is so out of the way from Malaysia. We've had inheritance tax before, and it was suspended in 1991. And I think that we should reintroduce inheritance tax, because at the end of the day, this inheritance tax should be have also been accumulated as a on the benefit of the community as whole. And you can, the government has all the data, the government has all the statistics necessary to decide how much is that threshold of inheritance, so that the inheritance tax can be put upon you. Maybe it's 5 million, maybe it's 15 million, maybe it's 20 million. That's something that the government can decide based on the data and figures that they want. Why do I talk so long about tax before we enter other things?
No, we have to.
Yeah, because I think it's so necessary for us to first think about how can the government increase the country's
Revenue.
income and revenue, right? Before we talk about what pocket should then the budget go to. Yeah.
Of course, on top of this, there's the whole notion of SST widening it. There's also a GST reintroduction. Where is MUDA's position on these two progressive tax systems?
Well, MUDA, we've had a very lengthy debate and discussion on this, and I think at this point we are more prone towards supporting GST rather than SST, simply because I think there's a better transparency when it comes to GST than SST, because our application of SST right now means that there's a huge room for misappropriation by other people, like by the sellers, by corporations, by service providers, it's easier to abuse SST than GST, because GST is very clear cut, right? And I think one of the biggest issue about the previous GST introduction was that it was so huge at the first introduction itself. You can start GST at a, also in a progressive way. You can start by introducing maybe in the beginning just 3% across all levels before you go into 6%, and then maybe if you want to look into a more developed country where some of them even go into 12%, but we're not ready for that. It's important for us to balance between what the country needs in terms of income and also the readiness of our people. Because at the end of the day, if the people are not ready, be it GST or SST, but if the amount is too big for regular Malaysians that I meet day to day, then it will increase their living cost too much, and none of that will benefit the country at the end of the day.
I'm also trying to unpack where your assessment is when it comes to this government's management of public finances, and are you rather happy or satisfied with the level of management on the fiscal policy as it stands, or you feel that there are areas of concern that needs to be addressed, considering that now is the budget?
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, it's not all. I think one of the biggest role that MUDA is trying to play as an opposition is to not just like oppose everything, but to look at pockets of improvements that the government can play. I'm not saying that everything the government has done is bad. For example, as I've mentioned, the targeted subsidy. But I feel that on this front, I agree with Rafizi in the sense that he mentioned that, if the government is really serious talking about targeted subsidy, then just bite the bullet and go for it. Because now, as it stands, the government initially wanted to introduce this RON 95 subsidy so that we can get between 7 to 8 billion ringgit savings. But now it's only projected at 2.5 billion to 4 billion ringgit, which is like a huge difference altogether. Secondly, one of the things that I'm very unhappy about is that in the beginning, PMX has mentioned that this government will not introduce mega project anymore. And I am for it, because I feel that there are a lot of other things that the government should focus on, especially when the government kept on saying that we have a huge debt. So the money that we have should be focused on things, for example, like healthcare, for example, like education, in comparison to a mega project like Bandar Madani. Again, when we're talking about this project, it's not all bad, right? I understand that there are some pros to the project. But if you ask me directly, in comparison to having Bandar Madani and increasing the wages for our doctors, I would definitely say increase the wages of our doctors, right? Because as it stands right now, for example, in Johor, we are struggling with having nurses, like healthcare workers, because they would rather go to Singapore. We've experienced, and ever since the first time I was elected in 2022, there have been reports about nurses in Johor going to Singapore because they can get like the wage of a surgeon over there in comparison to in Malaysia. And these are the things that the government should be focusing on. How do you ensure that the healthcare workers are properly compensated? If you ask me, between Bandar Madani and improving our public hospitals, for example, in hospital like Hospital Sultan Aminah in Johor, that have been, there are so many comments and also complaints about the infrastructures in Hospital Sultan Aminah that people have to look at, the government has to look at. If you're talking about comparing Bandar Madani in Putrajaya, that will only benefit the people of Putrajaya, and increasing, having better social mobility, improving our public transport, not just in Kuala Lumpur, but across multiple other regions in Malaysia. Definitely, I would say that the government are not getting their priorities right. I think that is the biggest issue. So I hope that in this 2026 budget, the government has their priorities in place, and it's not just a candy budget.
So let's segue nicely then into from the revenue side to the expense side. Where do you think or where do you feel that the government should be spending a lot more on, or perhaps of a bit of a wish list, I suppose, coming up from this?
Well, I think I have like 4 or maybe 5 big wish lists. The first thing is definitely in terms of increasing our wage. because increasing wage and ensuring that there's better protection system to our workers would also increase productivity and consequently, increase our economic revenue in the country. I think the problem right now is that there are multiple research that has shown that Malaysia's productivity and its wage there's a huge gap. Our productivity have been increasing, but our wage have not been increasing that much. I commend the government's effort to increase a little bit the minimum wage from 1,500 to 1,700, but far from enough, right? The World Bank reported that for a young person without a family to live comfortably in Kuala Lumpur, you need at least 2,700 ringgit per month. That is 1,000 ringgit more than the minimum wage that we have right now. I'm going to share with you my experiences as somebody who goes down to the ground daily, right? Families, for example, I've met a family of 7 where the father's working. They have 5 kids. All 5 kids are still studying in school. The mother is not working because she has to be the homemaker. The father is just working as a lorry driver. The wage is not even 1,700 ringgit, it's even less than that. And these are the kids that they are trying to put to school. They have diapers to pay for, they have milk to pay for, they have schools to think of. When I went to their houses, when I went to their house, for example, the house was like, there was no furniture at all. There was just one sofa and then a lot of books for the
Is this
students
in
to
your
study
area
in my constituency
in Johor?
in Johor. But this is not unfortunately, this is not an exception. There are so many other cases like this because our wage is still not up to the par. I think one of the things that is very important when we're talking about the wage itself is what will the government do in 2026 budget to incentivize private companies to also pay a good minimum wage to others and have a better security to workers, including gig workers. And I think one of the things that I commend as well for this government is the introduction or trying to introduce the um, Gig Workers Protection Act, and this is something that I think is highly needed at this point of time because a lot of young people, especially, are working in the gig industry. The introduction of 1,700 ringgit is a good start, but then how do we ensure that private companies can pay can give a good wage to Malaysians? That's where I think competition is good, in the sense that when you have MNCs coming into Malaysia, for example, when you have outside investors coming into Malaysia, they would probably pay a lot more to attract talents into their companies, and that means that Malaysians have choices to stay in their country and work with these MNCs. But how do you ensure that this is balanced across regions? As of now, for example, a lot of young people are migrating out of their states because at the end of the day, if they want bigger wages, they go to big cities like Kuala Lumpur or even maybe Johor Bahru, for example. And a lot of them moved out of their states, meaning that the income circulation has been in certain regions only. And that is the reason why when you look at our income or our revenue between states and also productivity between states have a huge gap. For example, between Kuala Lumpur and Kedah and Perlis, there's a huge gap between productivity because a lot of the young people go to Kuala Lumpur. So how do government balance this regional difference? And this is something that I also talk about a lot in the Johor State Legislative Assembly, for example, with the introduction of Johor SEZ, Johor Singapore Economic Zone. How does the government of Johor want to ensure that um, all the investments, all the things that you're introducing is not just happening in Johor Bahru? How is that will be trickle down effect to Segamat, to Muar, to Mersing, similarly in Malaysia, in a larger picture?
Now
Yeah.
let's talk about that as well. Still on the wage, there has been a policy paper that has been tabled in the Parliament, the Progressive Wage Policy,
Mm,
and there it outlines a whole series of sets on how to increase wages in a more staggered
mm,
and a structured manner.
mm,
That policy has had a few pushbacks, including
mm,
that from, say, for instance, the MEF or the
mm,
Malaysian Employees Federation.
mm,
A few big companies like Maiden, for instance, are now trying to see how that progressive
mm,
wage policy can be
mm,
improved, not necessarily necessarily pushback, but it's just how they can improve. As you can see, the mood, especially from business owners, is that they might not necessarily see this as a bad thing. It's just that they might not necessarily see this way of doing it is the right way. Have there been any engagements by MUDA or by yourself to talk to business owners and the private sector on getting them on this side on increasing wage?
Well, we have engaged with multiple workers' unions as well on this front. But I have to admit, most of the time when we engage with the workers' unions rather than the business owners. And so understanding what kind of protections do they need. But I also understand the concerns of business owners as well, because at the end of the day, that's the reason why I mentioned whatever policies that the government have to introduce, it has to be balanced so that it protects both sides, right? If it only protects, for example, the workers, which I think is really important, because at the end of the day, more than 80% of Malaysians are workers, are the laborers, right? And so even if we want to focus our protection around these people, we also should not forget the protection on the employers. And how do we ensure that our local companies, our local businesses can still compete against MNCs that come into the country, and they don't lose out simply because, for example, they don't have enough capital to scale up, or they don't have enough capital to pay their workers. I think the progressive wage is something that is very interesting for us to look at. But I agree with you. How is that rolled out is something that really has to be discussed a lot more. There are a lot of efforts that were done by the previous economic minister, Rafizi Ramli, that I think is very interesting to look at in terms of, for example, the IPR effort, for example, or the fact that he's trying to introduce the progressive wage, for example.
IPR is the Initiative Pendapatan Rakyat.
Pendapatan Rakyat. I think these are all very interesting initiative because you can see that it has helped those who were in the initiative. Similarly, for progressive wage, it can help those who benefited from that progressive wage. But then there has to be a sort of like a report, even for the IPR. For example, I wanted to know after 1 year of introducing IPR, what is the pros of it? What happened to that? How can that be scaled up, for example? Because as of now, it hasn't been scaled up to that, to a more macro level. For progressive wage, for example, how can we ensure that we can protect both employers and employees at the same time, and ensuring that our local businesses, especially the SMEs, are protected when we're talking about increasing the wages. I've had one very interesting forum with the Parti Socialist Malaysia, and you would have thought that when we're talking about wages, that they would be very hardcore in saying that no, whatever, but you have to increase the wage today. But they're also, in fact, very realistic in the sense that we're thinking a lot about how. Because they've engaged with a lot of workers' unions, and they understand that it's important for the government to also protect the employers so that the employees can also similarly be protected. So I think these are the things that we need to look at in terms of the 2026 budget. And why I think that this 2026 budget is so important to talk about all these things, because it coincides with Malaysia's 13th plan, 13 Malaysia plan. So how can 2026 budget complement the RMK 13, or will it just be, disjointed and introduced as another election budget? Is something that we want to see.
You were talking about 4 areas of concern. Wage is one big thing.
Yeah.
What about the other items on your list?
The second one is education. I have and always have been a strong proponent for our education system to be improved. The initial reason why I joined activism in the first place was because of education. Because I feel that Malaysia is not short of talents. Malaysia is not short of people who are smart. But our issue is that our education system has been very like one-sided. It's only for the past decades, it have always been focused on academic only, and not focusing on those who are more TVET minded, for example, or those who are more skilled, those who are more interested into arts. How do we ensure that the Malaysian education system can protect all of our children with different interests, with different backgrounds, and how do we ensure that these protections are in place for them? One of the things that attract me was that there was this one movement right now by the arts activists in Malaysia, by the arts practitioner, where they are trying to push for our education to focus a lot more also on improving the arts education in schools. And I think that's not something that is so bad, because a lot of Malaysians, and I've been in MOE for a short moment of time, and there
You
are
have?
research.
When was this?
I was with Padu. That was actually my first
Wow.
work
Okay.
after I left legal practice.
Oh, okay.
practice. I was with PADU, which was
Yes.
the organization responsible to monitor the education blueprint. And we've made the polling to identify the reasons why students dropped out from school. And largely it's because they have no interest in academic pathway anymore. And so how do you ensure that these people can still access other pathways and not just academic? That's first. Secondly, I think there's a huge responsibility on government to improve our teachers training capacity. We've changed the system so that our teachers right now are supposed to be the creme de la creme, right? They're the best of the crop. It's not very easy for you to get into IPG or UPSI anymore. People used to think that teaching is like
Yeah.
the last option, but it's not that, right? It's not easy. It's actually what people maybe do not know. It's not that easy to get into IPG or UPSI. You have to be a very excellent student to go there. But once you are in the system, what does the government do to ensure that they are consistently upskilled? There's a constant and also consistent training for the teachers to improve their teaching pedagogy. Because let's face it, education today grows exponentially in comparison to education like 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, when I was in high school, when you were in school. With the growth of internet, with the growth of social media, with the growth of AI, there are so many learning tools that can help our education. And so the teachers must also be consistently upskilled so that they are up to date with the kinds of teachings that you can have in the classroom. The problem is that if we stick to only whiteboard and desk, if our education doesn't evolve beyond that, how are we going to chase after our neighboring countries? The sad part is when we're looking at PISA results, for example, which is the biggest determinant, like the one of the biggest determinant in the country in terms of students' capabilities. Uh, Unfortunately, Malaysia used to be one of the best in the region, but right now we are trailing behind Thailand and Vietnam, and that is there's a strong um, that's a strong indicator that there's something wrong with our education system that we need to fix. Teaching pedagogy, for example, I've covered that. The second thing that I think we really have to look into is the early education, and this is something that I'm extremely passionate about. I just want to share with you. For example, I've met students in my constituency at the age of 15 and 16 who still cannot read or write. And Malaysians usually don't know this. They thought that, oh, membaca is something that everyone knows how to do.
Yeah, we take it for granted.
Yeah, it became something that is obviously
Natural.
everyone can, right? But it's actually not. A lot of our students are still trailing behind in terms of basic literacy and numeracy. A lot of world studies have indicated that the first 3 years of early education is actually the most important part of education to ensure that students have basic literacy and numeracy. So that has to be a very strong investment into our early education, early childhood education, and looking into what is the best way to ensure that at the age of if right now in our sekolah rendah primary school is between the age of 7 to 9, how can we ensure that the students know how to read, write, count, right? And this is something that is extremely important. I remember one of the things when we were in Padu, and I think this is something that consistently ongoing right now as well, is that um, thinking about what kind of teaching pedagogy that can happen in the classroom. When you're talking about 7 to 9 years old, um, thematic teaching is more important. Fun-based teaching, fun-based learning is more important, because at the end of the day, you want to make them feel that education is fun, right? One of the things that I realized when I went to my constituency as well, there are students. I recently went to one of the PPR in my constituency. I was supposed to visit a different house, But when I arrived there, I saw this one young girl was playing in front of the lift. She was playing with the host. It was a weekday. It was a schooling day. And I asked her, kenapa tak sekolah? Tak sihat ke? Why didn't you go to school? Are you not feeling well? And she said, oh, no, memang tak sekolah. I just don't go to school. Then I said, why? Mak tak ada duit. That's what she said. My mother doesn't have money. And I asked her, how old is she? She's 8 years old. This 8 years old kid is missing out on her early childhood education because her mother
Sorry, this is in
doesn't have
Johor Bahru.
money. This is in Johor Bahru. This is in urban area. And again, she is not an isolated case. There have been many cases where young kids couldn't go to school because there's not enough support for parents, especially young parents when they're starting their life. Support in terms of protection, but also support in terms of how do these kids go to school, right? Sometimes the mother work, the father, in that case, she's actually taken care of by her grandmother. The mother and father are both out of the picture. The grandmother has to go to work, and so she didn't go to school. So what are the kind of interventions that the government is doing to ensure that these kids who have been trailing behind can still go to school? You can talk about because right now everyone is arguing about nak UPSR balik ke tak, nak SPM balik ke tak. People are talking about that. Fine, you can talk about assessments all you want, but if kids are not in classrooms, right? If the pedagogy is not right, if the teachers are not upskilled, then assessments will not help you out at all, right? It's not the matter of at the end of the road apa yang jadi, but the journey towards assessment tu, how do you improve that? I think that's the thing that the government has to focus on when we're talking about education in this country.
We'll go for one short break before we continue our conversation with YB Amira. We'll be right back after these messages.
Hari esok tak dapat diduga. Tapi sediakah kita?
Thanks for continuing on with us. I have with me YB Amira, the acting president of MUDA. We're discussing not just the budget 2026, but of course the Sabah state elections as well. We'll get to that second part later. I still want to go through with the two other parts of your list that you think that the government should be focusing on, considering that the first two items that you brought up, which are wages and education, quite frankly, are the ones that are also resonating quite strongly with me, with my day job. So there's not much pushback on that sense from me on those 2 points. But let's go through your list still again. What are the two other areas that you think the government should be focusing on?
The third one is something that I am very passionate about as well, because this is something that my constituency face on a yearly basis, and everyone is facing this on a daily basis, which is in terms of climate change. I think not just myself, but I know that there's a lot of people out there who's really waiting to see whether this government is serious or not in ensuring that there's a very strong climate action plan from Malaysia. I'm just going to cite, for example, a couple of cases that shows why it's important for us to have this climate action plan, right? The first one was when we were hit by the 2021 huge flood. And that was one of the things that sort of like propelled MUDA forward, was when we execute the Misi Banjir, because there was a huge flood in 2021. And it shows how unready we are to face such a huge disaster at such a big scale at that point of time. And that has still been continuing on until today. For example, in my constituency in Putra Wangsa, we face about like 3 to 4 times a year flooding. And because we are an urban area.
I'm a Johorian. I'm trying to understand, Puteri Wangsa,
that's
ada
the surprise.
flooding lah, people don't go to school. What is happening, man?
Yeah. because people usually do not understand that these kind of things can happen a lot of times in urban areas as well. Urban poor sometimes, I mean, we're talking about school, for example. Urban poor is something that people overlook because people think that you live in a city, surely you have money, right? But when you live in a city, your living cost is higher. If your wage is still the same as those who live in rural area, then it's even tougher for you to survive. And when we're talking about climate, for example, because of our terrible urban planning that we've inherited from decades ago, urban areas are so prone to flash floods. Putri Wangsa, for example, in every flood season in Johor, which I hate to call it flood season because, Malaysians, we love to see countries with seasons. We love to see countries celebrate winter, celebrate summer, celebrate spring. And then there's us celebrating, not celebrating, but we only have flood season, for example. And in Putri
And it's
Wangsa,
approaching soon,
and
fast.
it's approaching soon. We just went to a briefing on this monsoon Timur Laut, and we're expecting between November till February there will be a huge monsoon Timur Laut, and we're expecting flood. In Puchu Wangsa, every time this happens, we open 6 to 9 PPS because there's a lot of victims of floods in Puchu Wangsa, and I consistently have to do fundraising effort because of our unreadiness. For example,
PPS is Pusat Pemindahan Sementara
yes,
di I don't know what the translation is, the temporary relief
yes,
centers.
yes, yes, temporary relief centers. And what happened is that there was one flood. There was one time when I went to the PPS and people were complaining to me, "Oh, YB, we had to, obviously they had to evacuate their homes as quickly as possible, right? So they didn't have chance to like bring anything necessity, and they were like, we haven't received our basic sanitary kits. We haven't received our toothbrush. We haven't received, and this was like already the second day of the flood. And so I checked in with JKM because these are the things that were supposed to be provided by JKM. And JKM told us is that, oh, YB, because flood has happened initially in Kota Tinggi, and so we had to bring all the basic kits to Kota Tinggi. So now when it happens in Johor Bahru, all the kids are already being sent to Kota Tinggi, so we don't have kids here. And so when these kind of things happen, this unpreparedness happen, we have to step in and do fundraising or out of our own pocket money to ensure that the people have these basic kits. Now, what are the things that I'm expecting the government to do? Is not to just focus on what happens post flood. Definitely, that's still important. But what will the government do in terms of mitigation and also adaptation as well? There are a lot of rancangan Tempatan Banjir, which is trying to prevent floods from happening. But what is happening right now, right? But we're not supposed to just talk about the big projects when we're talking about mitigating flood. Simple things, for example, we know that the rainfall collection in comparison to 3 decades ago is different. We have unusually huge rainfall these days in comparison to 3 decades ago. However, in terms of our urban development, in terms of our local council requirement for developers to develop drains, to develop what is kolam takungan in English?
Reservoir centers.
Reservoir centers. All of these things are still following the same rules as we followed 3 decades ago. That doesn't make sense because the rainfall is no longer the same, and so the drains couldn't afford to circulate the rainfall at its best possible way. Uncontrolled development, for example, you can't just kept on handing out license after license of development without thinking of the effects. Because at the end of the day, for example, when there's a huge development at the because we are all connected. Malaysia is one peninsula Malaysia, for example. We're all connected, right? From when development from Kuala Lumpur, it can affect all the way down to Johor. And all these kind of things are things that the government has to have a large plan. It's not something that you do local council by local council basis only. Because at the end of the day, even, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, the development that happens in Kuala Lumpur will affect PJ, will affect Bangsa, will affect Serdang, will affect all those things will be affected. What is the government's urban development plan to ensure that we can counter flash floods, for example.
Speaking of which, so there's the Urban Development Act that was currently brought up for review before it
Yeah.
was retabled at the Parliament.
Yeah.
Where is MUDA's position when
Yeah.
it comes to the Urban Renewal Act?
Yeah. We've had multiple forums, podcasts, debate, you name it, on Urban Renewal Act. Our stance is that we're not against government trying to sort of improve infrastructures, because these are things that they're saying, right? Like, we can't biarkan, in an old buildings that are crumbling down to continue there. But there has to be a fair form of compensation to the people. And we disagree when you're only asking about like 50 to 80% of agreement from the people in order for the building to be acquired and redeveloped. The reason, because why do I say that fair compensation is very difficult? Because it's not just about giving out houses. It's not just about, okay, keluar daripada lembah pantai, for example, you pindah to Serdang. This is trying to sort of, you are remanufacturing and you are re-engineering their whole life ecosystem.
Would you consider this as gentrification?
Yeah, I've said that multiple times as well, because at the end of the day, when you redevelop this area, definitely the houses will go up in prices, right? We're already seeing this in Johor, for example. A lot of the high-rise houses cannot be afforded by Johorians themselves, and so at the end of the day, a lot of the people who bought these houses are not from Johor, and Johorians only become renters. So when these redevelopments happen, what is the safeguard to ensure that these people that you ask to go out can still acquire the houses? Can they? Will you still sell the house at the rate that they can afford, which is maybe less than 300,000 ringgit? There's no, there's nothing in the act or in the minister's explanation to show that they are able to do this. You don't want to see Lembah Pantai to suddenly lost its identity, or even in Johor Bahru, for example, you don't want to see Johorians to, at the end of the day, continue only renting in their own state and having to sort of like live with their parents forever and ever. And this is the plague of my generation, because we can't afford houses. And if you redevelop these places that our parents think that, oh, I live here, my kids will one day live here, where are we going? Where are young people going? You send them off back to the rural areas. You send them back off to, outside of the urban areas. What happens to their livelihoods? Most likely, these places that you are sending them off to have no LRT. What happens to their social mobility? So these are the things that we are questioning about URA. It's not necessarily the concept of it, but the practice of it. And how do you ensure that the people say are there? Because at the end of the day, this is their right.
Following back to, say, flood mitigation and urban management, where do you see the performance of, say, for instance, the disaster relief organization NADMA, as well as the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment? Have they been performing up to mark based on your estimation? One is mitigating risks and dangers. Another one is policy.
Yeah. One of the things that I was unhappy about with NADMA is the fact that flash floods were not recognized as a disaster in NADMA. And so in my constituency, we've always been struggling with, how do we ensure that these victims of flash floods will also get compensation? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether the flood happens to your house for 1 hour or it happens in one day. If your items are rosak, it's gone. It's not about the case of how long is the water there. As long as it's there, it affects your economic well-being. It affects your houses. It affects your facilities, right? So these are one of the things that I think we really need to look into. And one of the things that I think is also important for us to discuss is that, are we prepared on the possibilities of other forms of disasters, and not just talking about flood? For example, in Johor, recently, for twice, we've experienced minor earthquakes.
Yeah.
And that was
Actually a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of tremors,
Yeah,
minor tremors.
minor tremors. But But that really shocked everyone, right? Because we've never had that. We've never had any class when we were in sekolah rendah or sekolah menengah. We weren't trained about what happens if there's an earthquake, what happens if there's a tremor. We only see in ads where, if in Japan they train their kids, if there's an earthquake, you go under the table. We haven't done all of that. So what is NATMA doing to ensure that there's a preparedness on regular Malaysians? Preparedness in terms of when it comes to banjir, when it comes to flood, how do you act? When it comes to earthquake, how do you act? And all these things are things that are supposed to be provided since they were young kids, and not something that you just show adverts in television, a 1 minute ads on langkah-langkah menangani banjir, and then wash hands, settle kerja. No, that's not how it works, right? How do you integrate that within the education system is something that is super important to talk about. Another thing,
the last item that that I want to go through with you is on the last item of where you think the government should be spending.
Yeah.
Where do you see that that point?
And the final one, but just one final thing about the climate thing
Yeah.
is that one of the things that I'm trying to fight for is a better climate finance plan as well. Because without a proper climate finance plan, then you can't fund all these rancangan tebatan banjir, all these drainage improvements. And so what I'm trying to introduce in Johor is a climate budget tagging, just so there's a better transparency on what we're spending in terms of budget to counter climate. For example, in Johor, we are building this huge data center, which we know will also affect water shortage. There is a lot of cases where when you have data center, consequently you have water shortage. What is the government's plan to ensure that when you have this kind of projects, other parts of our ecosystem is not disturbed? So that's just the last part, which is the climate action plan. The final one that I want to touch on is also something that the government have not been focusing on, which is our arts and culture. And this is something that is really huge, and I encourage Malaysians who have not really been looking at it to really look into it. Why do we have to invest into arts and culture? Because our arts and culture is what unites Malaysians together. What is the identity of Malaysians? That's shaped through our arts and culture, right? And I've spoken about this multiple times. For example, we grew up on Petronas adverts, and that gave us a sense of unity through our Petronas adverts. How is this then scaled up to a larger platform? Arts and culture, we're talking about books. How do we ensure that our local writers, our local artists, our local poets, how are they supported through the government's initiative? Because as it stands, I don't see a cohesion plan on us protecting our arts and culture industry. Secondly, when we're talking about arts and culture, it's also very important when we're also attracting tourists, for example. Look at the Hallyu wave, right? The K-pop wave. That is the big identity of why people go to South Korea all the time, because of their culture over there. Japan, for example, how they preserve their culture, how they preserve their traditional buildings. These are the things that help them increase their tourism venture. I am, and I will have to say this here, I hope you allow me to say this.
Yeah.
I am deeply, deeply disappointed with our tourism minister. I don't think that our tourism minister is doing a good job in promoting tourism in Malaysia. We have Visit Malaysia 2026. What has been done to ensure that not just we are attracting outside tourists, what have been done to ensure that Malaysians also are attracted to visit other states in Malaysia, right? Back then, for example, I can see when I was younger, I can see like a lot of billboards. Melawat Langkawi, what's in Langkawi? Melawat Terengganu, what's in Langkawi? What's in Terengganu? But nowadays, you hardly see that anymore. And for example, when we're talking about promoting Malaysian-owned products, Malaysian-owned culture, why is it that the Ministry of Tourism is working together with Starbucks? What happened to our own local coffee? What happened to our own local businesses? Why are you not promoting these businesses instead? When we're talking about arts and culture, I think it's also very important, and this has been advocated by a lot of arts activists out there, for the government to also have a larger arts blueprint for Malaysia that includes starting from education all the way until the protection of our arts and culture workers.
Let's talk more about how this will translate into some of MUDA's movements in at the electoral polls. And we have to tie off this conversation with the Sabah elections, considering that this would be the first of the many precursors to the elections coming up to the general election, 16th, expected maybe towards the end of 2027. First of all, will MUDA participate in the Sabah state elections?
Well, the system within MUDA is that we acknowledge Sabah and Sarawak as the equal partners of the Peninsula Malaysia, in the same way that Malaysia Agreement was being drafted. And so it is entirely up to the decision of our Sabah chapter whether they want to contest or not. We've
So
had
it's
a PC.
decentralized in that
It's
way.
a decentralized in that way. We've had a press conference. Actually, it was last year, where our Sabah chapter did. Our Sabah chapter chairwoman, Faizra Rizalman, she did mention that there's an intention from the Sabah chapter to contest. And at the end of the day, whatever is the decision of the Sabah chapter, we full-heartedly agree. Obviously, as of right now, negotiations are still happening. We're still talking to other political parties. But however, the work still goes hand in hand into regardless of whether or not negotiations were tied up, whether or not there was any collaboration with other political parties, or whether or not MUDA is going to contest. Sabah is still a very important chapter for us, and MUDA will be there, and I myself will be there during the Sabah State's election. I think one of the things that is very important for us when it comes to Sabah State election is not just about securing a seat. Obviously, as a political party, you want to secure a seat. You don't become a political party without wanting to secure a seat. But at the end of the day, as the conversations around Sabah State's election and the visibility around Sabah State's election to talk about issues that are close to Sabahans, to champion the plights of the Sabahan. For example, when we're talking about climate action, there was a huge flood in Sabah, but not enough chatter or not enough talks around it. Meanwhile, it also doesn't just cause economic loss, it also causes the loss of lives. These are the things that have not had enough visibility towards Sabah. And I think for MUDA, most importantly than just who are we working with, where are we contesting, is how are we approaching Sabah State's election so that the conversation around Sabah for the people of Sabah are being uplifted to the federal level.
And it's also important for us to also discuss the alignment or the political alignment that you are facing, not just in Sabah, but with the rest of the country. A few months ago, there's this rather loose coalition of opposition members that were chaired by Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin, and you were part of that, I guess, meeting. Does that also mean that this loose opposition coalition is still going to take place in some form or shape, either at Sabah or at the federal level?
During the meeting, everyone was very conscious in saying that we do not want to discuss election because that is not the purpose of the meeting. It's not about forming election coalition. It's about forming a stronger opposition to provide a better check and balance towards the government. And so there was no chat about what kind of coalition will be formed towards election. It was really about how do we ensure that that in terms of, for example, subsidy, when we're talking about economy, when we're talking about climate, how do we ensure that the opposition have a place for us to sort of discuss and ensure that we become a strong check and balance? Because at the end of the day, a government is only as strong as the opposition as well. If you don't have a strong opposition, then the government will feel complacent and then you will not have the benefit to the people. So to answer your question, there wasn't any conversation about coalition at that point of time. And I am very well aware that political parties, including MUDA, are talking to other political parties on their own. MUDA, for example, we are not under any coalition. This is not asked by you, but I've had media friends asking me whether MUDA support the nomination of Tan Sri Muhyiddin as the
Actually, I would ask that question.
yeah,
So do you?
as the potential prime minister. First and foremost,
Sorry, why I hesitate to ask is that I don't want to put the cart before the
yeah,
horse.
yeah,
I would rather attack or examine and study the policies that
yeah,
the parties are going to be
yeah,
bringing forward,
yeah,
which is also quite refreshing to hear you presenting your ideas and views here because now's the time for us to perhaps attack you on those kind of things, rather than which.
That's true.
Might as well I ask you, which football club you,
Yeah.
you support.
Which I appreciate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's no basis
Yeah.
behind it. You understand?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anyway, since they were on topic, so does MUDA have that position to support?
First and foremost, we are not part of Perikatan Nasional. And with that, having said, we have no intention whatsoever as of right now to be part of Perikatan Nasional. In that sense, whoever is their prime minister candidate is their prime minister candidate and it's not ours.
Wow.
That's a
Okay.
point right now. Yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah.
guess that would be a fantastic way to end. As you can see, when we have a guest like Amira, it's all about managing time because she certainly does have a lot to unpack. But thank you very much, Amira,
Thank
for coming
you.
over. You've just heard the young Berhormat Amira Aisya Abdulaziz, the State Assembly woman for the seat of Putri Wangsa
Yeah.
in Tebrau Johor. Of course, she's also the acting president of MUDA. If you missed any part of this interview, I just head on to astroawani.com to find out more. Also, stay tuned to Astro Awani from 3 p.m. onwards, where my colleagues Asnan, pardon me, as well as Nina, I'm trying to figure out which one of my colleagues are going to be presenting the show tomorrow, are going to be presenting the show live here on Astro Awani from 3 p.m. onwards. So stay tuned on that one as well. Until then, have a pleasant week ahead. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Catch you in the next one.